Hi, this is Anthony, CEO of LI Tech Advisors, with another LI Tech Talk. And again, we have Nicole Osborne. We spoke to her a little over a year ago, and a lot has changed. She's an attorney firm that basically specializes in cybersecurity and so on, and also, especially in this era of AI, there's a lot of things happening. So I thought it was a good thing to bring her back in to update us and so on. Nicole, tell us a little about you and your firm.
Yeah, no, I'm really happy to be back. I'm Nicole Osborne. I'm a partner at Ruskin, Moscow, Faltischek. Ruskin, Moscow, Faltischek. We're a Long Island-based firm. We are what we call like a business firm. Anything that businesses may need assistance with, our firm can handle. Right? We have our core practice areas, our corporate law, financial services, health law, trust and estates, commercial litigation. So, real estate. So if there's really anything a business has to deal with, we can help someone with. My main practice areas at the firm are in cybersecurity and employment law. I spend day to day trying to help businesses either stay out of trouble or getting them out of trouble, right? So that's mainly what I do on my day to day. For cybersecurity, which is really what we're here focusing on today, I assist businesses in preventing data breaches, being compliant with the various cybersecurity laws that exist in the United States and internationally. And then if a data breach does occur, I help businesses manage those data breaches, report those data breaches, and help them with the fallout of the data breach, whether that be attorney general's investigations, class action lawsuits. So that's really what I do on a day to day.
That's great. Yeah. So basically, I had an incident with it was a prospect at the time, became a client that I told them, I said that they had a breach, and I said your first call should be to your attorney, and they wanted to know why, and I said you have attorney-client privilege immediately kicks in, and then you can then bring in the resources necessary, and so on, and so you can control the breach a lot better. But the big thing is that I'm wondering, like, since last year, what has changed, especially with cybersecurity, with AI, regulations, and so on in the
Right.
past year that might affect these businesses in general?
Yeah,
Like,
we do. We have had some updates. New York has updated its data breach notification law. No longer is it this idea as practically as soon as possible. We have a strict deadline we have to work within now for data breaches. They've also expanded what constitutes personally identifiable information in New York. So it's a whole new ball game really when it comes to managing data breaches. From like the actual what business needs need to do to prevent data breaches, those regulations really have not changed as much. However, we are seeing a really big change in the dynamics of how workplaces are operating because of AI. And I think businesses really need to grapple with the idea of how much are we going to allow our employees to utilize AI? And then, of course, do we even know if our employees are using AI, right, to do their jobs? And what sort of impacts that can have on company confidentiality, protection of company trade secrets. There's a lot of issues with AI that people really don't think of that aren't technical in nature. One, AI poses a huge cybersecurity risk, especially if people aren't using some of these more legitimate AI platforms. People could be downloading AI platforms that might actually be malicious in nature, that might accidentally compromise the systems of a business. Beyond that, even if we are talking about more legitimate uses, we're still in the development phase of most of this AI, right? We've heard about like the lawyers, for example, who have asked ChatGPT to write their briefs, and AI is just making things up, right? Faking case citations, giving information to people that isn't accurate, while tempting to really use AI. And I think AI has great places to be utilized. I think we still have to be really wary of how we're using it in the workplace.
what are the biggest mistakes businesses make in regards to that? Regards to this turning on Copilot or turning on, let's say, maybe not even have an AI policy in place. I mean, what are the biggest mistakes they tend to make regarding that?
Yeah, so I think there might be an over reliance on this idea of this is going to streamline how we do things. So I get concerned when people are automatically using AI to create transcriptions and minutes of all their meetings. There's this idea, especially for like board meetings, maybe you don't want a word for word transcription of everything that was said in that meeting, right? Minutes may be important, but you really want to control what's documented from these meetings. And if you just have these transcriptions that you're saving, if there's ever a litigation down the road on why a business made a certain decision, how they made that decision, I can say more often than not, there might be information in those transcriptions that's more harmful than helpful. Second to that, if you don't know your employees are using I think doing training on the appropriate use of AI and a company deciding how they want to use AI is really important. I don't think this is something that should be left up to the employees to decide what's best for them. So, really deciding what platforms you're going to find appropriate and not appropriate for employees to use and what they can use it for. I don't use AI really in my practice for my legal work per se, but I've definitely used ChatGPT when I'm trying to come up with a new title for a seminar I'm doing or things like that. There's times and
Mhm.
places where it can be helpful, but I'm certainly not using it for legal work yet. So I think in the sort of we're talking about ChatGPT type of things. So I think there's a time and a place for it, and businesses really need to make policies on how their employees can or can't. And I think not having that in place is detrimental.
I think that's so important. Yeah. There's a case in point too. I'm a proponent or against these AI note takers on
Right.
meetings. I knock them off immediately and I'm very careful about that because there was an incident I heard of that a firm let an employee go. All right. And what happened was that after the next meeting they had that other employee was normally invited to, she wasn't there anymore, and they were talking about her and so on, not knowing that her note taker scheduled was on that meeting and
Mm.
she got the notes from that meeting. And you got to be very careful what you're saying. Being very careful, like you said, is that everything gets recorded and so on. And maybe you don't want that to happen. So again, being very careful with that. So, give you an idea. These are the businesses, the risks businesses are taking, even with AI policy in place, is making sure that people follow that.
Policy's not good if you write it and you leave it on the shelf. That's almost worse in many instances if you have a policy
Mhm.
and you don't follow it. So if you're going to create policies, make sure you're enforcing the policies.
Absolutely. That's a
Right.
very good point. I see that happening too many times. I deal with a lot of schools, okay? And from a cybersecurity and legal compliance and so on. And I go into schools all the time. I say, listen, you need these things in place. All right. And they say, these cost money. Do I really need it? And it's, yeah, you do. And I said, you can open yourself up to a lawsuit if you don't have it because you're not adhering to Ed Law 2D or
Mm.
FERPA or so on. And I want to know like the five top things the schools should be doing to protect themselves against from a cybersecurity related lawsuit that they did their best effort. Because
Okay, that's a great question. So, one is being in compliance with the law, right? So, there are rules and regulations in place for school districts now. This isn't like 10 years ago where it wasn't as clear. They really have to think about making sure they have the required policies and procedures regarding cybersecurity and protecting student and teacher data. So, making sure they have those standards, the policies, and that their standards comply with the NIST standard that's set forth in the Education Law 2D regulations, really looking at their third party contracts. One of the biggest breaches that have ever occurred for a school district was a third party vendor. This power school breach that I think if anybody has a child in a school district, they've probably received a letter regarding this breach. And the rules and regulations do require that school districts have vendor contracts in place that require the protection of student data and actually requires that these contractors provide them with a data security and privacy plan on how they're going to protect the data. Those two things alone, I think, are very important. The third thing, and in this sense, I don't think school districts are very different than any just business. I know it's a difficult thing to make an investment in something that doesn't directly go to the mission, right? Cybersecurity, if you're looking at it just from a 1,000-foot view, doesn't directly relate to the educational mission of a school district. Just like a lot of times, cybersecurity, it's not like a sales department in a company, right? It's not a money generating section. But in the long run, having good cybersecurity policies and procedures will directly lift and support the mission. If a school has a data breach or a ransomware attack, or their systems are shut down, schools don't operate like how they did when I went to school, right? Where people are just writing on a chalkboard with chalk. They're using this technology and they might not be able to serve the students, provide the education they need if they don't have access to their servers and systems. So ensure you're investing in cybersecurity, doing your annual assessments to identify vulnerabilities, fix those vulnerabilities, identify a data protection officer, someone who's going to be in charge of this, someone who's day to day they understand that this is our mission is protecting the data and security of students because A school is not going to be able to operate and a business cannot operate if their staff and employees are more concerned about like the protection of their own data and what's going to happen to them now following a breach. They're going to be distracted and they're not going to be able to adequately do their jobs. Businesses, schools have to focus on cybersecurity.
That's great advice. I see that, like I tell my clients and even prospects that call up or anybody for advice that calls me, I tell them that these are the basic things that you need. You got to have these things in place. And like you said, the policies and procedures, and also execute on them. Make sure every employee knows what they are and that they are it's embedded into the all the employees right up to the board of directors that they have the buy-in into it. I also make sure that the compliance officers and so on are people at the C level so that they can basically enforce the requirements, like especially with phishing and so on, with the training, automated training, like that's so important now these days, that they have somebody that if somebody's violating it, somebody can come down on them and say, hey, you got to comply, and write them up if need be. This is great. The last question I have for you, okay? I'm an MSP. I'm a technical advisor of an MSP component, but there's a lot of companies like us out there, okay? I make recommendations all the time to businesses, to schools, and so on to say, listen, this is what you need at a minimum. You need to have these things in place to protect yourselves. And even like warranties on the computers, I won't even have a contract with a client unless they have a warranty on their server. So we can basically quickly have it fixed. Same thing with cybersecurity and so on. If I say somebody you need to have MFA, multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, or Duo or some other method, and they come back to me and say, no, I don't want that, or I don't want to pay for this, I don't want that service. Now I'm still providing services to them. My question is, what kind of legal ramifications does it open up for the MSP for a client that has declined a recommended service that will help protect their organization and then they get hacked?
I'd say you have to look at your contracts to start. Ps really should have strong contracts that limit their liability, have certain representations in place that they may make recommendations, but it's up to the client to decide whether or not they're going to do that. The MSP isn't going to be liable for a data breach if they don't put MS recommendations in place, and that was
Mhm.
caused by the client, not the MSP. I think if we're really talking about the limitation of liability, the main thing we really need to be looking at is how you're contracting with your clients. And this is
Right.
something you should be evaluating frequently. So if you had a contract put together 7 years ago, hopefully by a lawyer, you didn't just pull it off the internet type of thing, that contract really needs to be evaluated. And it needs to be deciding, are we currently protected in the way that we need to be protected? But when it comes to the clients and not wanting to have things like MFA, other sort of security measures, I think the big concern is we're seeing a big shift in the cybersecurity insurance market. I think a lot of clients for the last few years have taken the I got insurance route, right? I'm
Yeah.
safe, I have insurance. Not having really great tools like MFA in place, we're going to start to see you're not going to be able to get cybersecurity insurance coverage. We're already seeing the question is becoming more important on these sort of cybersecurity applications. The insurance carriers are really focusing on that. And I think there's a big risk of people checking yes boxes on applications without really understanding the ramifications of those yeses. So just because you might have MFA on one area of your system, like maybe you use it to log into your email when you're out of the office, but you don't have MFA for access to your servers, you don't have MFA for access to important documents or elsewhere. But the check, depending on the phrasing of the question, you just checked yes, but it's not really true because you're missing it in these other areas. You might then have the declination of coverage, right? So you
Mhm.
spent all this money on premiums for when something happened, and then you inadvertently misrepresented your systems on the application, and now that insurance no longer exists. So I
Yeah.
think there's really great contractual steps MSPs can take to protect themselves and limit their liability. But I also think clients really have to think about these recommendations and think about how is this going to impact our business if we don't do these things? Because a lot of times, especially things like MFA, they're seen as low hanging fruit now by not only the insurance carriers, but by the regulators.
Mhm. No, absolutely. I understand that. Yeah, and just saying, I do have in my contracts what we have reviewed by an attorney, and I do have it where basically I also have an out if the client doesn't listen to our recommendations and it becomes a security risk, it basically violates our agreement.
Yeah, because
I
depending
have
on
it.
how the MSP, what level they're managing a client, this client's systems could put your own systems at risk, and then
Yeah.
your systems could then put your other client systems at
Mhm.
risk. Be a real big trickle down effect of cybersecurity risk and liability.
Absolutely. Oh, this has been really educational, and I know we're coming to the end of our time here, but I want to thank you so much again for bringing us up to date. And I'm looking forward to, again, collaborating with you in the future. And definitely anything that happens in this requirements or so on, please let me know, and we'll have another one of these updates.
No,
So,
thank you
again,
so much for
appreciate your
having
time,
me.
Nicole.
No,
Thank
it's
you.
been great.
Okay.